Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a fascinating discussion with Gershom Gorenberg, author of the recently published book, War of Shadows, Codebreakers, Spies, and the Secret Struggle to Drive the Nazis from the Middle East. This book tells the story of the Nazis' brutal march into Egypt, the race for information in the North African theater of World War II, and the battle of cryptographers on both sides. This book is a feat of historical research and storytelling and a rethinking of the popular narrative of the war. It portrays the war not as an inevitable clash of heroes and villains, but a spiraling series of failures and accidents and triumphs that spread into Africa and nearly beyond. Before I have the honor of formally introducing our guest author, I politely request, and I see everybody's done it so far, that everyone please mute their audio to minimize background noises. And please remember to unmute when you wish to ask Mr. Gorenberg a question during the question and answer session. Mr. Gorenberg has requested that you please set to split screen after the introduction. You're going to show a film, Gershom?
I'm going to show photographs.
So it'll be split screen, so you can see the speaker and what he's showing. Okay, this morning's distinguished speaker, Gershom Gorenberg, is an American-born Israeli historian and journalist who's been covering Middle Eastern affairs for over 35 years. After graduating with a BA from the University of California at Santa Cruz, he later moved to Israel and completed a master's degree from Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Other books Mr. Gorenberg has written include The Accidental Empire, Israel and the Birth of the Settlements, and The Unmaking of Israel. He is a senior correspondent for the American Prospect, a columnist for the Washington Post, and has written for the Atlantic Monthly, the New York Times Magazine, and the New York Review of Books. Mr. Gorenberg currently resides in Jerusalem with his wife, Myra Novak, and their 3 children. And he will be a guest lecturer at Columbia University School of Journalism this year. Please welcome Gershom Gorenberg. And I'll go on mute also.
Thank you very, very much. Just as a note, I've sent to you via the chat a link for how you can find and order a copy of The Unmaking of Israel. And in fact, you should also now see the first slide, and you can also click on places on that screen and reach pages where you can order the book. I want to thank you for having me here today, long distance. When I started working on this book, I told people I was writing about the war in the Middle East. And I got quizzical looks. People said, which one, which war? The Gulf War, the war in Syria, the 6-Day War, and I would surprise the war, World War II. And then the looks grew even more quizzical because as I realized in American memory of the war against Germany, memory tends to leap from Pearl Harbor, from America entering the war, to D-Day, to we won. And yet, and this I want to stress, for more than 3 years, for more than half the war, North Africa was where British and then Allied forces fought Italy and Germany. For half the war, that was the main front of the Western Front of World War II. And for much of that time, the rest of the Middle East was under direct threat of Axis conquest. And not only that, the real story of the decisive battle is the story of an intelligence breakthrough. And that part of the story is either missing or very fragmentary in accounts of the war. The heroes have been erased, and not by accident. To understand this, I need to take you on time travel. This is one of those guided tours that hop from one landmark to another. And in this case, our time machine will be going from one date to another. So I'll tell you where we are, and please stay with me. Our first stop is central Cairo on the 1st of July, 1942. And if you were sitting in that lovely sidewalk cafe or looking down the street between the apartment buildings and the department stores of a city that had been built to be the Paris of the Middle East, if you look west toward the Nile, you will see pillars of smoke rising from the British Army's General Headquarters, Middle East, from the British Embassy, from the Royal Air Force Headquarters, from the offices of the Special Operations Executive, the secret agency that supports the resistance in Nazi-occupied countries. Clerks and soldiers are burning papers, code books, plans, maps, orders. In fact, the fires are so hot that some of the papers don't burn up. They're lifted up by the heat and float out over the city. If, like many people in Cairo that day, you want to take your money out of the bank, you'll find lines down the block. And when you get inside, the tellers will hand you worn out bills that should have been taken out of circulation because they've run out of money that's in decent shape. There's also long lines outside the shops of leather workers who sell suitcases. On the morning of the 1st of July, 1942, a young British cipher officer, code officer named June Watkins, finishes her shift in the Royal Air Force code room in the basement of a downtown hotel, and she walks out on the street and runs into a friend, a South African officer, who offers to take her to coffee at Grappy's Garden Cafe, a favorite hangout of British officers. Well, when they get there, they find out the garden is closed. They have to sit inside, so they sit inside for their coffee, but June goes down to the ladies' room and looks out the window into the garden, and she sees that the waiters are out in the courtyard painting signs in German, welcoming the officers of Erwin Rommel's Axis army. At the train station, the Cairo train station, it looks like the scene in Casablanca on the day before the fall of Paris, except that there's no rain falling. The train station is packed with people who want to get out of town. In the case of Cairo, they're either trying to get on trains south to Sudan or to get on the overnight train to Palestine. The British Army reserves, over the course of 3 days, 1,600 seats on the train for civilians who have worked for them, who have worked for the British Army or intelligence agencies and are a particular danger in the case of Axis conquest. The 1,600 include 100 Italian and German refugee Jews who have worked as translators or agents, and they want to get to Palestine, but the British authorities in Palestine say, no way, we can't let them in because the 1939 British White Paper drastically limits Jewish immigration. The Turkish embassy in Cairo sends a radiogram to Ankara, and it says the number of Egyptian Jews who desire visas for Turkey is increasing every day. Let us know what we should do. Are we supposed to give them visas? And the answer comes back by radio in code, and it says, requests for visas traveling to Turkey, if they seem abnormal or for immigration purposes, must be refused. Visas should not be given to any Egyptian at their isolated request. That is to say, do not let these Jewish potential refugees into Turkey. Now, you're looking at the text of these telegrams from 1942 in English. What's going on? Well, what happened is, as I said, they were sent by radio. They were intercepted by British wireless operators, translated, decoded, and translated by the hyper-secret agency, British agency known as the Government Communications Headquarters, an agency so secret that its very existence was unknown to the public. If you saw the film The Imitation Game, you saw a, well, inaccurate version of how GCHQ broke the German Enigma code. It also broke the diplomatic codes of 24 countries, including Turkey, and for that matter, some of the US diplomatic codes. The reason all this is going on is that everybody knew on that day that Cairo was facing the same fate as Paris, Belgrade, Warsaw, and cities across Europe. That is to say, Axis conquest. And if you want to understand why, let's look at the map. 10 days earlier, the German and Italian army in Libya under Erwin Rommel had conquered the port town of Tobruk, where the red arrow is pointing. This was a small port town, and after that conquest, the British army seemed to be in a state of collapse. In 10 days, Rommel's army advances from Tobruk all the way to El Alamein, 350 miles in 10 days. And El Alamein is this spot in the desert that's only 60 miles from Alexandria. Let's stop for a second and talk about Erwin Rommel. That's Rommel under the red arrow, wearing the captured British sand goggles that were his trademark. Rommel was the most famous of the German generals. His fame in Germany actually began in 1937 when he was not yet a general. He published a book called Infantry Tactics. Despite the name, this was really a memoir of his experiences as a young infantry commander in the Great War, what we call World War I. And what he had learned from his experience was that trench warfare was a terrible thing, that a commander should avoid static warfare, instead find the weak point in the enemy defenses and rush through, move fast. In World War II, Rommel became the very embodiment of the German tactic known as blitzkrieg, fast, mobile tank warfare. He wrote a memoir of his time in North Africa called War Without Hate, describing it as basically just a deadly game of soldiers, which completely ignored the fact that there were civilians who lived in Libya, Egypt, and Tunisia. A post-war story grew up around Rommel that he was a good German, a patriot unstained by Nazism. This legend was helped along by the fact that he committed suicide after he allegedly, and I stress the word allegedly, took part in a coup bid against Hitler in 1944. So hold on to that name, Rommel. But let's remember that for right now, we're still in the summer of 1942, when Palestine is actually a very uncertain refuge from Rommel's forces. Because if you look at this map again, you can see that Jerusalem is barely further from El Alamein than El Alamein is from Tobruk. If Rommel has advanced to El Alamein, who knows? He could be in Jerusalem in another 2 weeks. The expectation among Jews in Eretz Israel, in Palestine, is very simple. Rommel is coming. This was obviously frightening, but the full meaning was actually quite unclear. On the one hand, just a few days before, a news item had come out of London based on smuggled information that reached the Polish government in exile, which said that 700,000 Polish Jews had already been murdered by the Nazis, some of them in gas chambers carried on trucks. With information gathered from elsewhere, 3 days later, the World Jewish Congress publishes its own report that says altogether in Nazi-occupied Europe, 1 million Jews have been slain. This is how the item appeared on the 30th of June, 1942, in the New York Times on page 7 next to the Saks Fifth Avenue ad. Now, before you come to conclusions about the Times not being concerned about Jews or being anti-Semitic, you have to understand the dilemma of the editor. You couldn't not publish the item, but you couldn't really believe it either. So you looked for some sort of middle way, and the Times was far from being alone in its doubts. This is an editorial that ran the same day in the Hebrew newspaper Hatzofeh in Tel Aviv about these numbers. It said, "These items come as rumors taken from the air, passed from one informant to another, one writer to another. It's irresponsible of news agencies to be publishing these figures, which are not backed up by evidence and are simply causing despair." So for the 75,000 Jews in Egypt and the 500,000 in Palestine, the fear of Rommel does not match the full threat. What they don't know is that, for instance, in the Italian colony of Libya, under orders from Mussolini, the authorities have already begun trucking the Jews of Cyrenaica, that's eastern Libya, to a concentration camp in the desert. They don't know that the SS is so confident of Rommel's victory in Egypt that it has set up an Einsatzkommando, a mobile killing unit for the Middle East. And in fact, on that same day, the 1st of July, 1942, the commander is appointed, an SS officer named Walter Rauf. Rauf's orders are to carry out executive measures, bland bureaucratic term for mass murder, against the Jews of Egypt. And once Rommel advances, the targets will be the Jews of Palestine. And if he realizes his plans to advance all the way to the oil fields of Iraq, the 25,000 Jews of Syria and Lebanon and the 100,000 or more in Iraq will also be in danger. By the way, just parenthetically, at the time that this is taking place, the city of Baghdad of 1942 was 1/6 Jewish. It was as Jewish a city as, say, New York is today. But as I said, in Palestine, people don't know about this, about Rauf or about the Nazi plans. To understand what happened next at El Alamein, we need to get back in our time machine and go back nearly 3 years to the first week of September 1939 to the train tracks of Poland, where we're going to watch 2 trains, one entering Poland and one leaving. The first train left Berlin on the 3rd of September 1939, 2 days after the German invasion of Poland, and it's headed east into Poland, and it's codenamed America, and it's Hitler's private train. He wants to see the conquest of Poland taking place. He's got a battalion that's in charge of his security, and in charge of that battalion, in command of that battalion, he's put his favorite general, Erwin Rommel. Rommel proudly writes home to his wife that he'd been invited to sit next to Hitler at lunch and that he, Rommel, quote, was allowed to chat for almost 2 hours, unquote, with Hitler about military problems. Rommel writes, he, Hitler, is extraordinarily friendly towards me. Rommel basks in the attention from Hitler. He worships Hitler. At the same time that this is happening, the commander of the SS and the Gestapo, Reinhard Heydrich, tells Germany's military intelligence chief, Wilhelm Canaris, that in Poland, quote, the nobility, the Catholic clergy, and the Jews must be killed, unquote. And we have similar testimony about Nazi plans from an officer serving under the German Army Chief of Staff, Franz Halder. The officer writes in his journal that some of what he heard from Halder about plans for the civilian population was too awful to write down. So I leave it to you to consider whether Rommel did or did not know the meaning of German victories. But in any case, Rommel is elated to watch the invasion. It fits his idea of rapid warfare, of tanks breaking through enemy defenses. But tanks weren't the only machine you needed for this kind of warfare, because headquarters had to be in touch with the commanders of the tank forces, who needed to be in touch with the units under them. And the only way you could do that was by radio. But sending battle plans and orders by radio is shouting them out to the world. As one historian, John Ferris, writes of the dilemma of World War II commanders, only a traitor used radio, only a fool did not. You had to find a way to encrypt, to encipher, to code your messages. But traditional codes and ciphers were too easy to break. A cipher replaces one letter with another. So if you get a ciphered message in German as well as in English, and Z is the most common letter, you know that it represents E, which is really the most common letter in the language. And from there, you can go on to break the whole cipher. But what if the cipher were different? If it changed each time you wrote a letter? If you typed EEE and it came out TZQ and so on, a seemingly random string of letters? The solution that the German military found that allowed it to do this was a machine put on the market by a Berlin company in the early 1920s for business use, the Enigma. Here's an Enigma machine. What you see is a keyboard just like on a typewriter. Behind it, this is a light board. Each of these little lights is marked by a letter in the same pattern as the keyboard, 26 lights. In the back, there are 3 turning wheels. Each wheel has 26 electrical contacts on each side, one for each letter of the alphabet. And there's wires inside that connect the contacts on each side, but the connections are hidden. Contact A on this side could be connected to any of the 26 contacts on the other side. Contact B can be connected to any of the 25 remaining contacts, and so forth. If you press a letter, say you press the letter B, an electric signal runs through all 3 wheels, goes through another tangle of wires at the end, goes back through all 3 wheels, and lights up a light on the keyboard. And then, before you press the next letter, the wheels turn. So the next time the tangle is different, and even if you typed BBB, you would get different letters every time. The clerk takes down the letters that lights up and sends that by radio. In 1926, the German Navy adopted Enigma as its encryption machine, then the Army, then the Air Force. The beauty of the device was, well, first of all, it's the size of a typewriter. It weighs 15 pounds. You can carry it around in your command car. And to decipher a message, all you have to do is type in the gibberish that you've received by radio, and the original message will light up on the light board. That is, if you have a machine wired the same way and you know the settings, the starting positions of the wheels and other parts of the machine. Now, the possible number of settings on an Enigma was 150 quintillion. That's how many different ways it was possible to set the machine up. The number of ways, that's the little number. That's the small number. The number of ways that you could wire the wheels came out to a number expressed by 5, followed by 92 zeros. It was obvious that the enemy could never test so many combinations, that there was no mathematic solution. In our terms, the Enigma obviously provided unbreakable end-to-end encryption, as you've seen your apps promise. But as I said, there's 2 trains. The second train leaves Warsaw on September 6, 1939, and it's headed east, away from Warsaw and away from the German forces. And on board is the man who ultimately can be said to have defeated Rommel. His name is Marian Ryuski. He's a 34-year-old mathematician. He's smiling. In this picture, he wouldn't have been smiling on the train because under orders, he had left his wife and 2 small children in Warsaw. 10 years earlier, while working on his master's degree in mathematics, he was recruited by Polish military intelligence for its cipher bureau. And in autumn of 1932, he was assigned to break Enigma. He applied a branch of mathematics that was his specialty called permutation theory to the problem. Now, without getting into the math, which would require a couple of years of an advanced seminar, I can tell you that in hindsight, it's obvious that this is the branch of mathematics that you would apply to the problem. It was obvious to Marian Ryuski, but to nobody else. Within 3 months, he had figured out the wiring, and then he and 2 assistants rapidly found a way to find the settings. But as war approached in 1939, the Germans were changing the settings every day, and Ryuski and his 2 assistants couldn't keep up. So in July of 1939, they had invited 2 British cryptologists, code breakers, from the ultra-secret GCHQ to Warsaw, where they shared their work. In September of 39, as I said, Ryuski got on the train. He escaped via eastern Poland, Romania, finally reached France, where he continued to advise the British. The best of Britain's mathematical code breakers never believed that Ryuski figured out the wiring on his own because it was impossible. They thought that the Poles must have managed to steal an Enigma machine. But all of Britain's work against Enigma during the war was founded on what Ryuski had done beforehand. Okay, back in the time machine, we're going to just travel in space now, same date, different place. While Ryuski is fleeing, GCHQ, the government communications headquarters, settles into its new location in a state called Bletchley Park, which is a hideous mansion on the rail line between Oxford and Cambridge. Among the people moving in is the Cambridge mathematician Alan Turing, an eccentric man, although the fact that he was sent on delicate missions to agencies in France and the United States casts doubt on the popular picture of him in the Imitation Game as being socially inept. Based on Ryuski's work, Turing designed a giant machine that ran through Enigma settings and looked for the one that could have produced a particular text. For this to work, you needed to have a good idea of a text that would appear in messages, what was called a crib. That is, it depended on the Germans ignoring basic code security and using the same phrases over and over again, whether it was Heil Hitler or Sandstorm or airplane fuel or whatever it might be. You knew that these things were going to repeat, and you could look for them in the message. And it also depended on the Germans being certain that it didn't matter that they were doing this because, of course, they were using the unbreakable encryption of Enigma. Another one of the people moving in was another Cambridge mathematician named Gordon Welchman, ethereal academician. Besides rapidly coming up with a design change that was essential to actually making Turing's machine work, Welchman's really big idea by November of 1939 was that code breaking had to be turned into an industry. It wasn't a job for academic geniuses working alone in small rooms. He proposes dividing research, finding new ways to break Enigma from production, the daily code breaking work, that there'd be 3 shifts a day around the clock, that code breaking and translating and interpreting the messages would be broken into separate jobs. Bletchley Park goes from 100 or so staff members when the war starts to thousands by the end. It was, in our terms, in our anachronistic terms, a high-tech startup. At first, with the help of the Poles in Paris, Bletchley Park begins finding Enigma settings and reading the message. You need to do it over and over again each day as the settings change. And then you have to translate the messages and make sense of them. And that's not easy either because it uses German military jargon. Sometimes there's a list. It says 1, 500, 2, 350. And you don't know whether that refers to tons of fuel or to tanks or to soldiers unless you've learned enough about the messages overall. So as one person working in the translation portion of the assembly line said, we were eavesdroppers, strangers reading stolen scraps of other people's correspondence. Okay, we're back in our time machine. We're moving forward to the summer of 1941. We're still at Bletchley Park. On the far side of Europe, Germany has invaded the Soviet Union. British radio operators are picking up messages sent by shortwave by German units, including the special police units that have been sent into occupied Soviet territory. Bletchley Park has broken the cipher used by the police. Here are 2 of the messages that were translated and sent in the small select package of intelligence information that went to Winston Churchill every day. Police Regiment South Battalion 314 shot 367 Jews. Notice the red line around the number. Churchill always wrote in red ink, including when he was annotating these messages. So when I, as the historian, am digging through these papers in the British National Archive, when I see the red ink, I know that I'm looking to what caught Churchill's attention. Here's another message from a little bit later. Over 3,000 Jews shot by various units, again marked by Churchill. So these messages, which remained classified for over 50 years, show us that, unlike the New York Times, Bletchley Park and Churchill knew that the massacres in Eastern Europe were real. They didn't know the full numbers because they only had scattered bits. They weren't intercepting all the messages. Not all the messages were sent by radio. But full reports were flowing to SS headquarters in Berlin. And in September of 1941, SS Commander Heydrich decides that shooting Jews is wearing down the SS and police. He wants efficiency. He wants to use trucks that transport and kill at the same time. And he assigns the job of producing mobile gas chambers to the head of the SS technical arm, Walter Rauff. By November 1941, Rauff has got a prototype and afterwards goes into production. The estimates of the number of people murdered in Rauff's trucks are, well, the low end of the estimates is 500,000. Let's get back in the time machine. We're still at Bletchley Park. We're now in April of 1942. Welchman's crew finally breaks into the Enigma networks used between Berlin and Rommel's headquarters in North Africa, and this message is decoded. It says that as part of a British appreciation assessment of the situation on the island of Malta in the Mediterranean, it is reported from a good source that the British will not be able to launch an offensive before the 1st of June. This is incredible intelligence information. It tells Rommel that as long as he starts his offensive before the 1st of June, he can preempt the British. The message is sent to the desk of a 24-year-old woman named Margaret Story. Story had been recruited 2 years before at the rank of untrained clerk. Like Welchman, being recruited by Bletchley Park transformed her life. Because by 1942, Bletchley Park's success at decrypting German messages has gotten into its commanders' nightmares. They're thinking, if we're reading their messages, are they reading our messages? We need somebody to go over all of the decoded messages and look for signs of our information that will tell us how their espionage is working. And Story is made a research specialist in charge of finding enemy intelligence. I'm sorry, I cannot show you her picture. She left almost no trace in her life but the documents of her work. It took me many, many months of searching to find a few people who had known her. They told me, picture her as slight, as wearing dark cardigans, as always smoking, as self-effacing, introspective, as being very intelligent, as having daunting intelligence, as having absolutely formidable intelligence, as being shy, very shy, as the brain, as speaking 9 languages, as having a sense of humor that she kept absolutely top secret. Well, more messages follow from the good source, obviously in Cairo. Here's one of Story's reports. The good source messages report British positions, plans, and mistakes. Rommel, in the perception of the time, had some sort of intuition, some ESP about British plans and positions. He didn't have ESP. He had the best intelligence source that the Axis had during the entire course of the war. So Bletchley Park needs to know who or what is the good source and how do we stop it. In retrospect, the suspects included, well, perhaps it was a spy brought to Cairo by Laszlo Almasi, the Hungarian desert explorer turned German intelligence officer. Almasi, by the way, was later turned into a romantic fictional character in the book and movie The English Patient, but without a whole lot of connection to the real person. So maybe it was Almasi's spy. Maybe it was King Farouk of Egypt or somebody close to him. Farouk was 22 years old. He was known to have pro-Axis leanings. In fact, it would later turn out that in advance of the British invasion of Iran in 1942, he had warned Germany. In February of 1942, the British ambassador in Egypt put together a coup that forced Farouk to appoint a pro-Allied prime minister, but Farouk was still king, and maybe he or somebody near him was leaking information. Or maybe the good source was really a British code stolen from an embassy before the war. Major Valentine Vivian of MI6, Britain's overseas spy agency, had visited Berlin before the war and turned in a scathing report about how easy it was to break into the embassy. Says the Gestapo could, if they were so inclined, introduce nightly and for a practically unlimited period each night any number of locksmiths and experts in safe breaking, therefore having continuous access to current papers, telegrams, and prints without leaving any trace. And what he didn't mention here was also obviously code books. So maybe it's a British code. Well, I'm not giving away all the spoilers. I will leave this mystery for the book of who the good source was. But we're going to jump forward in time again, just a little bit this time, to June 21st, 1942. Rommel has taken Tobruk. His orders are to advance only to the Egyptian border. But then he gets another message from the good source in Cairo, and it says, if Rommel intends to take the Nile Delta, that is to say, Alexandria, Cairo, this is a suitable moment. The British are in a state of collapse. Rommel has the personality of a compulsive gambler. This time he's a gambler with an inside tip. He's reading the other side's cards. He invades Egypt. In order for his invasion to succeed, he needs to reach Alexandria. He needs a port where ships coming from Italy or Greece across the Mediterranean can deliver supplies to them so they don't have to be trucked across the desert. In fact, he really needs to get all the way to Palestine, where there's Royal Air Force bases where planes would take off to attack those ships. And the good source tells him that the British Army will mount its final defense at it's got its line to defend Egypt set up at a place called Mersa Matruh on the Egyptian coast. In the course of writing the book, I made a careful comparison of Allied and Axis intelligence documents, including ones that I found by locating the descendant of one of the key officers. The papers were lying untouched for over 70 years in the attic. And what I was able to figure out is that it was precisely at this moment that Bletchley Park succeeded in silencing the good source. How, again, I'll leave that for the book, but the critical thing is that on June 25th, General Claude Auchinleck, the head of Britain's Middle East Command, changes the defensive plan. He decides there will be a small force here at Marsa Matruh to hold back the Germans, but the main defense is going to be at El Alamein. And the reason for that is that there's this thing called the Qattara Depression, which is a deep cliff-lined depression in the desert. And El Alamein is the narrowest spot between the coast and the impassable Qattara Depression. So this is the one place where Rommel can't do an end run around the defensive line, where he has to go straight into British defenses. There's no good source from Cairo. Rommel is clueless. He thinks after he passes Marsa Matruh that he's basically succeeded and that the road is virtually open to the cities of Egypt. On the 30th of June, again, a decoded Enigma message, the medical officer of his army issues instructions for soldiers' medical precautions when they get to the cities of Egypt. They shouldn't bathe or drink fresh water. They should not buy ice cream on the street because of fear of disease. On the 1st of July, as Rommel reaches El Alamein, he describes what's going to happen there as mopping up a strong point. He thinks that he's got a skirmish left. Instead, he's blocked. The Egyptian army is waiting for him. It stops him. He can't advance. His supply lines are stretched back across the desert all the way to Libya. To provide 1 gallon of gasoline for his tanks, you have to burn another gallon of gasoline in the trucks that bring it. On the 20th of July, SS officer Walter Rauff flies from Greece to Tobruk to El Alamein to meet with Rommel's chief of staff to start planning mass murder. And he's told, our advance into Cairo it's been slowed down and has to wait. We're short on supplies, especially fuel. Your team, Walter Rauff, should wait in Athens for Rommel to take the Nile. But it never happens. El Alamein was the line in the sand, quite literally the sand. It took until November, several months later, before the British Army under a new commander, Bernard Montgomery, drove the Axis forces back. And Churchill would call that last battle at El Alamein the end of the beginning of the war. It was the turning point. That's as far as the Germans and the Italians got on that front. But I would argue that the real end of the beginning was July, when Rommel was stopped, because once he didn't reach Alexandria, his army was doomed. A constant stream of deciphered Enigma messages showed that his army was short of fuel, food, and supplies. He couldn't reach Alexandria, and Hitler won't let him retreat. The victory in the secret war was the key to the victory at El Alamein. Rommel and the SS under Rauff never reached Cairo, and Rommel never knew of the role of Ryuski, of Welchman, of Turing, and of Margaret Story in his defeat. So why did this story remain secret? Well, the answer to that question is in another long classified document, an order given on the 19th of April, 1945, just before victory in Europe. And the order was that everybody who knew about decoding Enigma must keep this secret for the rest of their lives. Not just for the war, but for the rest of their lives. And several reasons were given, but the first reason was no possible excuse must be given to the Germans to explain away their complete defeat by force of arms. After World War I, this conspiracy theory had grown in Germany that they had somehow been betrayed, that there'd been a stab in the back. And this led to the willingness to try again in World War II. The British High Command says they need to feel that pure strength defeated them. And if they hear about this intelligence breakthrough, who knows, they might make a third attempt to conquer the world. So this has to remain secret forever. In other words, those who fought the War of Shadows were essentially told, you played an extraordinary role in the victory, and for the victory to the last, history must not remember you. I'd like to close with a few thoughts. First of all, Enigma could be broken because human beings designed it. And first of all, another human being could look at the problem differently. And because People took shortcuts. They repeated phrases. They got careless. They did the equivalent of writing down their long password on a piece of paper and leaving it on the table, or using their birthday for a password. The flaw in the machine was the human beings who used it. Technology has changed immensely since then, but not human beings. And hence, perfect security keeps failing time after time. The second thing is, were it not for the victory at El Alamein, the SS would have reached Cairo, Tel Aviv, and Jerusalem. That's one part, and there's more in the book War of Shadows, of how the standard map in people's minds of the Holocaust being only in Europe is too small of a map. It also affected North Africa and the Middle East. Finally, this is one very small sampling of the intrigues that would shape the Middle East after the war. Just as a start, as I describe in the book, the 1942 coup in Egypt carried out by the British ambassador discredited Farouk, King Farouk, and eventually was the catalyst of the 1952 revolution that brought Nasser and then Sadat to power in Egypt. So the whole history of the Middle East since then was affected by these events. I hope in telling the story and in writing the story to have honored the forgotten heroes, and I hope that you enjoy reading the full story. Thank you very much.
Hey,
As I said again, if you just click on the book, you can get to, or you go to my website, gershomgorenberg.com, you can find links to buy the book, and I'll put the link back in chat again so you can see that.
there we go. Okay. Oops. I messed up here. Hit the wrong thing. Hold on. All right, I must have hit the wrong thing. Here I am. Okay. Okay. Now we, if one at a time, if people would like to ask questions, I'll recognize anybody. Maybe put your hand up, and you can unmute and ask a question of Gershom if anybody has a question. It seems like everyone's frozen. I don't know if that's, can you hear me?
I hear you.
You hear me, okay.
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, would anybody like to ask a question of Mr. Gorenberg? Well, what I was wondering, oh, okay, Sheila, go ahead.
You had said that everybody involved was told that they had to maintain the secrets like forever. So was there like a period of time? Obviously, you have gained access to this information. Was it because the people involved have passed away, because so many years have gone by? How was it that now this information is coming to light that was required to be secret for so many years?
That's a great question. So until the mid 70s or the late 70s, there was no information available. The existence of Enigma, or the code name that was used for Enigma Intelligence Ultra, was completely unknown. The first book that was published about it was apparently in Polish, which was not covered by British rules. A Polish colonel apparently discovered the role of Ryuski and published something. After that, a French officer who had been involved in the liaison between Britain and Poland published a memoir. So the secret was beginning to come out. And in the 70s, the British government, quite surprisingly, and to be honest, there isn't a good explanation to this day of why, allowed a British officer who'd been in charge of distributing the information to commanders, published a book about the ultra secret that was the first really big break in the secrecy. The book is incredibly inaccurate. He did not really know how Ultra had been broken, how Enigma had been broken, but the very fact that it existed, that Enigma had been broken and that this information had been critical to the war came out for the first time. At that stage, the papers were all still secret. He was writing on the basis of memory. And in fact, when Gordon Welchman wrote a memoir, which he published in the United States in the early 80s, Welchman moved to the United States after the war and worked after that for the rest of his life in security. And when the secret came out, he said, great, I can finally tell the story of the most meaningful and, as he put it, fun part of my life. And he published the book, and FBI agents showed up at his door, and he said, well, wait a minute, I'm an American citizen. This isn't America. That was Britain. And they said, well, there's this federal regulation that was promulgated in the 1940s that says that everything that's secret in Britain is secret here. And they basically hounded him for the remaining years of his life for publishing how Enigma was broken. But by the 1990s, GCHQ began releasing some information. And it has released information in stages, not all at once. So there were papers that I saw that were actually released in the 90s, and then information that was released in the aughts, and then information that's been released more recently than that, that sheds light on this. And that material, some of it's other people looked at, some of it, to the best of my knowledge, had not been gone through thoroughly by anybody else, provided a big part of this story. In addition to that, what I wanted to know was what were the sources that went into the messages that the good source sent. And that involved a search in American and German and Italian archives, and sometimes in people's attics, as I've said. It involved putting together a lot of pieces that hadn't been put together before. One of those pieces, just as an example, is one day I'm looking through the archives, and by the nature of war, most of the figures were male, and by the nature of the structure at Lexie Park, where most of the people hired originally for the top jobs were male, mostly male, and I'm going through this record, and all of a sudden I see this reference to the enemy intelligence reports by Miss Story. And I said, I got to find out who this person was. Now, I also have to tell you that as a Hebrew speaker, this was quite incredible because there was no information about who Miss Story was. And in Hebrew, Miss Story means mysterious. So I'm looking at the mysterious Miss Story. Well, what I could find in the archives was the work that she had done, but nothing about who she was. That's where it was good having the experience of having been a journalist for many years, which gave me the tools to track down eventually people who had known her and who could fill in some of the picture of what she looked like, what she sounded like, what her personality was, because she played this amazing role.
I believe Ted has a question. Ted, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was just wondering, about 2 years ago, there was a book, a new movie out about touring and about this whole effort. Have you seen that? And what's your opinion of the accuracy of that movie?
The movie is called The Imitation Game.
Yeah.
It's it honors Alan Turing. Turing was in fact a brilliant man who played a major role in breaking Enigma. It is inaccurate. It is accurate. First of all, it is accurate in the sense that Turing was in fact homosexual and was hounded because of that, and because of the persecution of his sexual orientation. Apparently, that was the reason that he committed suicide in the early 1950s, dying as a rather anonymous figure. He also played a key role in the invention of computers, as the movie indicates. In many other ways, the movie is very, very stylized and inaccurate. Turing was very far from doing this all by himself. He did not build, in the movie, you see him building the machine himself, as if, he sat there with a screwdriver and wires and put it together. That's nonsense. And the whole process of breaking Enigma that's described in the movie is, it's extremely simplified in order to fit it into a fast-moving movie plot.
Okay. Yeah. The other question I have is I have seen in many books reference to how the British are doing all kind of weird things just to lead the Germans believe that they're getting information from other sources, such as they would take a body of a British soldier and put secret information on him and dump him in a place where Germans could find it. Have you seen anything along those lines?
Yes, there was a major effort on the British part, all sorts of deception measures that they used to feed false information to the Germans. The story of the corpse of the man who never was is one of the more famous ones, but the day-to-day way that they did that is that one of the versions of Enigma that Bletchley Park broke was the version of Enigma used by the Abwehr, German military intelligence. And by breaking those messages, Britain was very quickly able to capture virtually every spy that the Germans tried to put into England.
Thanks.
And then they caught those people and they gave them a choice. You know, you can stay alive and stay out of prison if you start working for us. And the way that they worked for Britain is that they sent back false information. And then by decoding other Enigma messages, you could tell whether or not the Germans had eaten the bait, whether they'd been caught by this false information. And that was a process that went on throughout the war. Again, enabled by breaking Enigma.
Thank you very much.
Did anyone else have a question?
You want to answer the question?
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
A few years ago on Channel 13, they had a series on the women of Bletchley Park. Would you comment on that?
Yeah. Look, the original group of people who were hired at the beginning of the war to break the codes were, it was a heavily male group because they recruited from, for the most part, Oxford and Cambridge, which were at that point extremely male universities. I think in each of them there was one associated female college. And so that's where the experts were coming from. In fact, I went through the pay documents. Even when they did recruit women, it was an accepted thing that the women got paid like 60% of what the men did. One of the women who was recruited was a woman named Joan Clark. If you saw The Imitation Game, there's this whole thing where she gets recruited because she solves a crossword puzzle very quickly. That's nonsense. She was a star student at Cambridge of Gordon Welchman. And when Welchman was told we need more people, or when he realized we need more people, his first place he went is he went to his best students and he said, listen, I have some very important work that will help the war effort. Would you like to leave college and work for me? And one of those people was Joan Clark. And she was a top mathematician, and she worked throughout the war on breaking the version of Enigma used by the German Navy, a critical element in winning the Battle of the Atlantic. By breaking the German U-boat version of Enigma, you could locate the German submarines and prevent attacks on Allied shipping. As the war went on, there started to be a whole level of additional tasks for which more women were recruited. First of all, they needed translators. I have a wonderful story of a young woman, Welsh woman, who's sitting in the library at Cardiff University doing her German homework. She was studying German literature. And a strange man walks up to her and says, would you like to work for the Foreign Office? And won't tell her what the job is. But she gets hired and sent to Bletchley Park and becomes a translator of Enigma messages, for instance. Somewhere in that process, Margaret Story was also hired. And then there were a whole lot of women who were eventually brought there to operate the machines, the so-called bombas, so that by the end of the war, the majority of people working there were actually women. And they, like everybody else, kept this secret, most of them, for the rest of their lives.
Stella, I see you had a question. So,
yeah, hi. I know you said you got your information from the attics, and archives? Did you use the Library of Congress, or did you ever go to look at any books that might have been in between in the Egyptian Geniza?
The Egyptian Geniza is earlier than that. It doesn't contain documents from this period. I used lots and lots of books from different libraries, but I obviously carefully studied previous research on the subject, but my bias as a historian, as is usually the case for historians, is that the thing that matters most is not what's in books, it's what's in the primary documents. And one of the main functions of books for me is finding out where there are more primary documents to be found. So if you look at War of Shadows, you'll see page after page of bibliography of articles and books that I used. I had one of the things that was very helpful in that respect is that I teach one semester a year at Columbia University, and the Columbia University Library was I should mention, that's made possible by the Knapp Family Foundation, which pays for me being there. And the Columbia University Library was a fantastic resource for that. The National Library in Israel was another resource. But the most important resources were the pieces of paper, the original documents from the moment.
Okay, I have to close up because we've had an hour now, but I just want to say thank you to Gershom Gorenberg for sharing this extraordinary story with us today. Gershom's book, War of Shadows, Codebreakers, Spies, and the Secret Struggle to Drive the Nazis from the Middle East, is available from the Hatchet Book Group as well as Amazon and other sites. If you go to the chat, Gershom has posted where you can obtain the book. I also want to say thank you also to Rabbi Kogan for recommending today's speaker, and to the Hillcrest Executive Director, Rose Sigler, the office staff, Melissa Gerstein and Juana Santos, for their assistance with today's event. And thank you to everyone who participated in this morning's virtual program. I hope you enjoyed it. And I want to wish everybody a lovely day.
So,
Thank you very, very much for joining me today. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.